Turning 150 sounds like a miracle, until the birthday candles start casting shadows over everything else. Because the moment human beings stop dying in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, the question is no longer just how long one person can live. It becomes a much stranger question. What happens to a civilization built for short lives? A 150-year lifespan would not simply add extra birthdays. It would stretch childhood, delay inheritance, rewrite marriage, jam career ladders, bend housing markets, stress pensions, magnify inequality, and force governments to decide who gets us more time and who does not. And the unsettling part is that this idea no longer lives entirely in science, fiction. Humanity has already pulled off one longevity miracle. Average life expectancy worldwide was about 32 years in 1900. Today, it is more than double that. The species has already learned how to push death back once through sanitation, vaccines, nutrition, and medicine. Now laboratories are trying something even more ambitious, slowing the biological clock itself. So if humans actually reached 150, what would change first? It would not be the skyline. It would not be the hospital. It would be the schedule of an entire species. Current reality, the modern world quietly assumes that a human life comes in 3 acts. First, education, then work, then retirement. It is such a familiar structure that most people never notice it. Schools train children for careers that may last 40 years. Mortgages are designed to be paid off before old age. Pension systems assume retirement is long, but not too long. Marriage vows quietly assume that forever probably means a few decades, not a century. But that structure was built during a very unusual moment in history. Over the last century, human beings dramatically expanded life expectancy. Global life expectancy rose from about 32 years in 1900 to roughly 73 years in the 2020s. That was one of the biggest upgrades in the history of the species. It changed family size, urban design, health systems, war, economics, and the way people imagined the future. And the aging wave is already here. The United Nations says that by the mid-2030s, there will be 265 million people aged 80 and older, outnumbering infants. By the late 2070s, around 2 billion people aged 65 and over are projected to outnumber children under 18. In other words, humanity is moving into a world where old age is no longer a side story. It becomes the main story. Even today, the edges of this future are visible. Pew Research projected that the global number of centenarians could reach 3.7 million by 2050, up from nearly 500,000 in 2015. That sounds like a tiny group, but it is a signal flare. The human lifespan is already pressing against assumptions built into the economy. Then there is the science. Researchers are not merely treating old diseases anymore. They are investigating aging itself. One of the most talked about approaches is partial cellular reprogramming, an attempt to restore more youthful biological patterns inside cells. In animal studies summarized in a 2024 Nature Communications review, partial reprogramming increased median lifespan in progeric mice by 33%, and another study extended the remaining lifespan of very old wild-type mice by 109%. That sounds extraordinary. It is. But there is a catch big enough to stop a victory parade. This evidence is in animals, not living humans. And the same technique carries major risks, including tumor formation and tissue failure if poorly controlled. That is what makes the question so dangerous. A 150-year lifespan is not guaranteed. It may never happen. But for the first time, it no longer sounds ridiculous. And once an idea crosses that line, markets begin funding it, governments begin tracking it, and people begin building their lives around the possibility. That is when history usually speeds up, the change begins. At first, the transition would probably look almost boring. Nobody wakes up one Tuesday and discovers that humans suddenly live to 150. The shift would begin as a string of small medical victories. Cancer survival improves. Heart disease arrives later. Regenerative therapies repair some tissues. Drugs that clear damaged cells or reset parts of the epigenetic clock become safer. Wealthy patients in sleek longevity clinics buy time in 5-year chunks. 90 starts to look like 60 used to. And because the change arrives gradually, most people underestimate it. The first generation with radically extended healthy life would keep doing ordinary things in deeply unnatural ways. A 72-year-old starts medical school. A 95-year-old launches a robotics company. A 110-year-old still sits on the board of a family conglomerate, not as a ceremonial relic, but as the sharpest person in the room. Children grow up with great-great-grandparents who still drive, invest, travel, and argue at dinner. The psychology of life begins to stretch. If adulthood might last a century, the pressure to choose a single career at 22 starts to look absurd. Education stops being a one-time event and becomes a recurring system upgrade. Reporting on neuroplasticity and aging points to something important here. The brain does not simply switch off after youth. Learning, exercise, sleep, social connection, and mentally demanding experiences still help older adults maintain cognitive fitness. That means a longer life would not just create more old people. It could create more people capable of reinventing themselves again and again. And that sounds wonderful, until time itself becomes a competitive advantage. Because in a 150-year world, the most valuable resource may no longer be money or land. It may be accumulated experience. One founder has 80 years of network, reputation, and capital. One politician has spent 60 years building influence. One investor has lived through 8 recessions, 3 AI booms, 2 energy transitions, and several wars. Newcomers are not just competing with older generations. They are competing with institutions disguised as individuals. But that still would not be the biggest problem. The biggest problem would be that almost every system on Earth assumes that people eventually leave. Escalation retirement would be the first illusion to collapse. Modern pension systems were not built for citizens who remain alive for another 50 or 60 years after leaving full-time work. The IMF has warned that aging societies put pressure on pensions and public policy, and that longevity risk can make pension and health systems unsustainable if societies fail to adapt. In a world of 150-year lives, that warning stops sounding technical and starts sounding like a budgetary siren. If people retire at 65 and live to 150, that is not retirement. That is a second adult lifetime funded by a shrinking base of workers. Taxes rise, governments borrow, younger voters revolt. Older voters resist any reform because they have already planned around promises made decades earlier. And suddenly, the most explosive political conflict in a country is not left versus right. It is old versus young. Japan offers a preview of what demographic pressure looks like before radical longevity even arrives. Nearly a third of Japan's population is over 65. More than 1 in 10 people there are already 80 or older. Its fertility rate fell to 1.2565, far below replacement level. The result is a society dealing with labor shortages, stress on social security, and pressure to redesign care using home monitoring and other technologies. That is a glimpse of the future under normal longevity. Extend healthy life dramatically, and the pressure multiplies. Labor markets would twist in unexpected ways. Experience would become more valuable, but promotion would slow to a crawl. The corner office stays occupied for decades longer. University tenure stretches into a miniature dynasty. The dream of waiting your turn quietly dies because nobody ahead seems interested in leaving. Economies would have more expertise, but less circulation. Housing would tighten too. Family homes remain occupied longer. Inheritance arrives later, perhaps when the heirs are already elderly themselves. A 78-year-old may still be waiting for a parent's estate to settle. Wealth compounds upward into long-lived family empires. And that is where longevity stops being a health story and becomes an inequality story, because the first reliable lifespans extending treatments would almost certainly be expensive. That means the rich would not just own more things, they would own more decades. Their companies would compound for longer. Their political networks would harden. Their mistakes would be survivable. Their children would receive guidance, capital, and influence from living ancestors who have been accumulating power since the previous century. This is where the emotional tone of the future changes. Longer life initially looks like liberation. Then it starts to resemble lock-in. Nations would respond very differently. Some would subsidize longevity technologies to prevent a biological aristocracy. Others would restrict them, fearing social chaos. Some would tie retirement age directly to healthy lifespan. Others would abandon the idea of retirement entirely and replace it with cyclical careers with mandatory sabbaticals and skill resets every few decades. Immigration would become even more politically charged because countries with too few young workers would need outsiders to keep entire sectors functioning. And then the numbers get global. The real crisis would arrive when longer life collides with everything else humanity is already struggling to manage: low fertility, expensive cities, climate stress, healthcare costs, and political systems built for short memories. By the mid-2030s, according to the UN, people aged 80 and older are expected to outnumber infants. That is a staggering sentence. It means the human future may soon contain more extreme old age than newborn life at the same time. Stretch that trend into a world where healthy lifespan races toward 150. And civilization faces an impossible question. How does a species renew itself when almost nobody leaves the stage? This is not only about crowding. In some countries, population would still decline because fertility is so low. In others, the problem would be a towering age imbalance. Either way, the crisis is renewal. Economies need young workers. Politics needs generational turnover. Science often advances when old assumptions lose power. Culture stays alive because new people arrive with new tastes, new angers, and new obsessions. But in a 150-year society, old institutions can remain staffed by the same minds for far longer. Some of those minds will be brilliant, some will be corrupt, most will simply be entrenched. Ministries, universities, corporations, and even social movements could become more stable, more experienced, and much harder to dislodge. And inside the family, the emotional map becomes even stranger. A child could grow up knowing 5 living generations. A 40-year-old might still be psychologically junior because a vigorous 110-year-old grandparent controls the business, the property, and the family mythology. Inheritance disputes turn into century-long Cold Wars. Divorce law becomes chaos. What does till death do us part mean if death is postponed deep into the next century? 40 years of marriage begins to look less like forever and more like phase 1. Then comes the deeper, quieter crisis, meaning. Much of human urgency comes from limitation. People race because time runs out. They start companies because youth feels brief. They forgive, panic, travel, marry, create, and sometimes self-destruct because life feels finite. Remove enough of that pressure and people gain freedom, but they may also lose momentum. A person with 120 healthy adult years ahead can delay everything: careers, children, commitments, reinvention, risk. The future stops feeling precious and starts feeling endless. And endless time can produce a very modern kind of paralysis. Unfortunately, solving that would be harder than curing wrinkles. Adaptation humanity would not sit still and panic forever. It would redesign itself. The first successful adaptation would be a new life structure. The old formula of education, work, retirement would be replaced by cycles. Learn, work, reset, learn again. Universities become places people return to at 25, 55, 85, and 120. Midlife crises multiply, but they also become more useful. A society with 150-year lives cannot afford to waste 80 healthy years of human ability simply because someone picked the wrong profession in young adulthood. Work would become modular. Governments and firms would create phased careers, long sabbaticals, and mandatory reskilling. Retirement age would no longer be fixed to a birthday. It would be linked to biological health, labor demand, and perhaps even cognitive assessments. That sounds cold. It would also be economically unavoidable. Cities would adapt too. Homes become multi-generational by design, with flexible walls, robotic assistance, and medical monitoring woven quietly into daily life. Japan's experiments with home care, remote monitoring, and keeping the elderly out of hospitals would spread worldwide, not as a niche response to aging, but as core infrastructure for long-lived populations. Medicine would split into 2 great missions. The first is extending healthy lifespan safely. The second is preserving purpose. One without the other creates a population that survives as longer, but does not know what to do with the extra decades. Some solutions would fail spectacularly. Governments might try pro-natalist campaigns to push birth rates upward, only to discover that people living to 150 feel even less urgency to have children early. Others might impose crude anti-aging restrictions, creating black markets where the wealthy buy illegal time. Still others would drift into a 2-tier species, those who age conventionally and those who can afford to update themselves. The successful societies would be the ones that understand a brutal truth. Longevity is not just a medical breakthrough. It is an operating system change for civilization, and operating systems always reshape everything running on top of them. The new world, once humanity adjusts, the new world would be astonishing. A 100-year-old engineer helps finish fusion infrastructure she began planning at 43. A 90-year-old architect redesigns coastal cities she watched flood half a century earlier. A 112-year-old biologist mentors researchers working on species restoration projects that take generations to complete. Long life would give civilization something it rarely has enough of. People who can think on the timescale of consequences. Politics could improve in surprising ways. A citizen who expects to be alive in 80 years may care more about seawalls, soil depletion, nuclear waste, debt, and atmospheric carbon. The future stops being an abstract place for descendants and becomes a neighborhood one fully expects to visit. There would be extraordinary opportunities in science and exploration. Multi-decade research programs become easier when the original team can remain alive long enough to see results. Space travel becomes more practical when a voyage lasting many years does not consume such a huge fraction of a human life. A society full of healthy people in their second and third centuries might become far more patient about building things that outlast elections, markets, and media cycles. But the negative side never disappears. Long-lived civilizations might also become more conservative, not politically in a narrow sense, but structurally. Old grievances linger longer, bad leaders survive longer. Failed ideas remain institutionalized by people who built careers defending them. History would not just be remembered more vividly. It would still be in the room, speaking, voting, and refusing to retire. Culture would become stranger, too. Fashion might recycle across a single lifetime. Music scenes would be crowded with artists on their fourth reinvention. Romance could split into new categories: short bond, long bond, renewable partnership, child-raising alliance, century contract. The phrase coming of age would stop meaning 18 and start meaning whatever age a person finally decides to become someone. And perhaps the most unsettling transformation would be generational identity. Today, a generation is a rough human rhythm. It rises, peaks, ages, and hands the world off. In a 150-year society, that rhythm breaks. Generations overlap so heavily that the handoff becomes blurry. Civilization stops moving in waves and starts moving in layers. Some of those layers would build cathedrals. Some would become ceilings. So would a 150-year life be a blessing or a disaster? It would be both, because it would please subscribe to encourage us.